Welcome everyone to the Great Lakes Permaculture Design Collaborative.
We are a trio of permaculturists.
Rhonda Baird from Bloomington, Indiana.
William Faith from Chicago, Illinois.
Milton Dixon from Ann Arbor, Michigan.
We're teaming up to create a hands-on learning experience
that can catapult you into a regenerative practice of your own.
glpdc.info
will send you to the host of our next Permaculture Design Certificate course.
We're going to be talking about microclimate today, and with me I have Rhonda Baird.
Hello.
And William Faith.
Hello.
So to kind of put it into perspective, we like to use the permaculture flower. So we're really going to be talking about land and nature stewardship, building, and tools and technology. Microclimate in terms of those concepts. So let's go to the next slide. This is an example of aspect and the effect aspect can have on a piece of property or a site. This is from southwest Idaho, and the slopes that are facing the sun, facing south in our northern climates, are dry and basically treeless, whereas the slopes facing the north are covered with trees. And it's just that difference in the amount of sun that they get and the amount of moisture then that allows.
Right. So what we see in this, and it's so interesting when we observe microclimates in the natural setting, and this one is really striking because there's very little moisture in this landscape. And so the cooler soil temperatures on those northern facing slopes allow a little bit more water to be available. And so what we see is that the plants are using those microclimates to their advantage to get established.
You can definitely see where the stands of trees are. That's where the water collects in the valleys there. So that's going to allow them to establish better, have a good source of water, and then from there they can extend outward. And you can use that edge to help develop systems in design to kind of extend out from what's already there by using what's already in the landscape.
Exactly.
So let's look at the next slide. This is kind of a diagram of solar aspect. And the main point I want to make here is that the similarity between a mountainside and buildings. So if you live, say, in a city, you're going to have similar effects to what you would see in also a mountainous landscape.
Absolutely.
The thing I like to point out here is that there's kind of this mirror image that you're looking at. To the untrained eye, you would just see, okay, yeah, there's a hill that goes up one side and goes up the other, but there's actually a very different situation going on with different considerations. And you have that little blue dotted line down near the bottom and then the red dotted line up near the top, because coolness tends to stay down near the bottom and the heat is up toward the further near the top of those elevations. So you have this little thermal belt in the middle that is usually the most comfortable. And
one of the things I like about this slide is that it points out in the top part with the valley, the different kinds of vegetation. And this is something you find no matter what kind of biome you're working in, whether it's the Southwest or temperate deciduous landscape, that the one side favors one kind of vegetation, like a hotter, drier landscape vegetation, and the other sides can do moisture, cooler. So we can mimic that in our developed landscapes.
So the next slide. This is an example of the heat island effect. This is actually a garden I had in Chicago on blacktop, on asphalt, and so combined with the fact that it was in a parking lot and just the city in general, this was a very hot place to grow plants. And then on top of that, the lack of water, the only water that was here came from the sky or was carted over here by hand. It made this a little bit of a difficult growing environment.
But I can see the mulch that's in that bed there, and that's going to make a tremendous difference. That's another example of creating a little bit of microclimate just by using some organic matter up on the top to keep that moisture in, keep the sun from drying out that soil. As we often say, the number one soil sin is to leave it bare. And by contrast, if you look at the bed that's just next to it, you can really see the difference.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I like about this bed too is that the plants are close together. Even though there's a couple of different varieties of things growing really close together and lots of diversity in the bed itself, the plants that are growing close together tend to do better because they will create their own microclimate. They will shade the soil, keep the temperature nice and cool, and they will, break rainfall so that it hits the soil surface gently. So plants modify their own microclimates and tend to work together, and that's really important in an area when you have an urban area where there's a lot of radiant temperature coming up.
Another point is that I went into this knowing that it was going to be a bit kind of an intense environment, and I tried to pick generally more plants that were more adapted to hotter, drier environments. So especially the amaranth and the sunflowers. Those are the ones that are grouped together so nicely.
They look very nice together.
The next slide is actually another diagram kind of really showing the difference between different areas. So rural, suburban, residential, commercial, so on, downtown. And really I find it striking a 6-degree difference between those two places.
Absolutely.
Not only does it make a big difference in your comfort, but if you're in a cold climate, you can use that difference to your advantage in the cold seasons, and you can use then in the summer when it's hot, especially we want to stay more cool and more comfortable. Then it's really important to consider how we can modify that microclimate in an urban environment to create more comfort for ourselves, to mitigate some of that heat island effect by basically mimicking a forest and keeping things shaded and cool.
Absolutely, tree cover can make a tremendous difference in there, and what we're really talking about here is thermal mass. At the end of the day, there's a lot of asphalt and concrete everywhere, and so that's taking all that radiation from the sun that's hitting it all day long and then radiating it out at times when we either can use it, say in the colder seasons, and at times when we don't want it, when it's already hot out. A really good example of this is xeriscaping, which is made really popular in Arizona for some ungodly reason, where they were trying to get rid of lawns, which of course we're all in agreement with, but they replaced it with large rocks. And then when you have a really hot, arid environment, that doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. But again, you can also take advantage of those things when you want to, and the difference there is how you use plant and tree covers.
And I think it's interesting too that it's not just the downtown areas that are spiked, but the suburban residential areas also spike a bit. So I think that has a lot to do, again, with thermal mass. Like, what is the percentage of paved roadway or shopping area and parking lot, things like that are all factors.
This next slide is an example of a windbreak. This is an orchard with a long row of trees to prevent, I presume, the prevailing winds. Probably also in spring from damaging the trees. To give the trees a little bit of a break when it comes to the wind. Haha, windbreak.
Definitely, it helps give them time to get established and build a bit of structure before they have to deal with heavier winds as they grow above.
Mm-hmm. And it also creates a calmer habitat for pollinators to work, which means there's going to be more pollination happening, which means there's going to be more fruit.
Definitely.
The windbreak can have an effect as much as 10 to 20 times downwind, depending upon the speed of the wind. But also, part of the effect of the windbreak is actually the wind going through the windbreak and slowing down. So, for example, a wall doesn't have the same effect as a shrub or a tree.
And you can decide how much you want to moderate it by how densely you plant it. If you want a little bit getting through, you want more of a diffusion array, you can do that. If you want to, if you're really trying to keep as much of it out as possible, then you can plant even more densely.
And this is just one row of trees, whereas you could have multiple rows if you wanted that dense effect.
I've always used the metaphor of an airplane wing. So think about lifting it up gently and lifting it, letting it back down slowly for a single. Or you could keep coming through and planting, 10 to 20 times out another windbreak so that the wind stays above your field area.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
This next slide, I thought it would be fun to put something that probably most of us could connect to, coffee. And this is an example of a shade-grown coffee plantation in Costa Rica. And you can see that the tree in the midground with the red leaves, that's actually acting to shade the coffee. And then, depending upon what they want to get out of the coffee, whether they want to give it more sun, maybe it's more established, they've pollarded the trees, essentially cutting off the limbs, but still keeping the tree alive. It'll resprout to allow more sun in.
And you can use that as in terms of succession too. If you're really trying to get them established, you would plant them under the shade tree, and then as they're becoming a bit stronger, you could clip them back. And another thing is also when we're talking about multiple yields in permaculture, if those trees can actually be productive beyond just shade-producing trees, that's when we're getting more out of them. It becomes a much more productive system.
Right. So I wanted to just put in there a little Mollison thing as a little quote, where he said that basically the yield of the system is theoretically unlimited. And I think this has a lot to do with microclimates, pushing that succession and continually finding new edges, new niches to fill in. Because whenever we create a microclimate, for one thing, what we're actually doing is expanding the number of niches again. So as long as we're filling in with useful plants, there is no limit to those yields.
Yeah, just more and more production.
Right.
Of various kinds.
Of various kinds.
The next slide, for contrast, I thought I'd show a regular coffee plantation. This is in Brazil this time.
Yep, that's definitely a site that only does one thing.
And it's so boring. and it requires a lot of energy to maintain a really limited system. This is a landscape that doesn't maybe have a future.
Definitely. I mean, and as we say, nature never works in straight lines. So you look at this, it seems so abstract and strange, contrasted against the last slide, which is like really lush and verdant.
Exactly.
This next slide, I wanted to emphasize how the sun could reflect off of a pond and create a microclimate.
Definitely. Where you site your pond matters a great deal. You can get multiple functions out of the pond just by where you put it. You can get a bunch of light gain into a house. It can help moderate temperature.
And you have to think of water as also a form of thermal mass. So it's really useful to have in the landscape, partially because we want a lot of water in the landscape in order to support growing things, life. But also, water in relation to garden beds can modify frost pockets and also help sub-irrigate the plants. So they're useful to have in the right places. And even within the pond, then we can identify new niches. We can grow watercress or harvest silt to put on garden beds for soil formation. Lots of different things going on in a pond.
Great. This next slide is an example of microclimate created by adding thermal mass around some fruit trees.
Yep, this is a practice called stone mulching. And this is where you have a colder climate where trees might have trouble getting established. The soil might be a little bit too cold. You can take that solar gain and turn that into heat that'll create a more hospitable environment. This is sort of an echo of xeriscaping, but actually used for production.
Right, so these stones are gonna soak up the sun's light, re-radiate that out at night, and also really where they're placed and how they're placed, they're gonna affect the soil temperature quite a bit. So the root systems of these trees will have a better environment to grow in. So that'll extend the root growth into the fall when trees are putting on about 80% of their root growth for the year. And it'll allow it to warm up in the spring sooner, which can affect the flowering time. So they may actually want an earlier flowering time in order to get a market advantage by having earlier fruit production. I won't swear that I'll never plant a fruit tree in the spring anymore, but fall is where it's at.
This next slide is an example of Espalier. It's basically trimming the tree so that it's a two-dimensional form, oftentimes along a wall, and that's, in my mind, that's where it's really useful. The thermal mass of the wall can really help protect tender blossoms on a frosty night.
And this is also another example of working vertically and conserving space by modifying tree shape. And then you can even graft these into other trees, graft the branches into other branches, and create a living fence out of it.
Absolutely. And as you can imagine, this particular specimen is in the flowering, so it isn't really leafed out yet. But after it leaves out and covers the building more, it's going to actually cool the brick and protect it from the elements, which will cut back on the energy use to keep the building cool in the summer. And it'll also extend the life of the building by not having to have the brick tuck pointed or replaced as soon.
Yeah, I've heard it can even extend the life of a building like that up to as much as 200 years.
Fantastic. That makes a lot of sense, right?
Indeed.
Well, and so this is just our short little tour of microclimates. Whether they're natural or developed, we can identify them and use them to create niches for, different species of plants that might not otherwise be able to thrive in our local environment.
And then also using microclimates can expand the variety of plants that we can grow, the animals that we can accommodate, and the ability to keep ourselves comfortable.
So when we are locating natural microclimates or developing new ones, we want to pay attention to several different things. Just to review, so aspect in relation to the sun, slope, shade and solar gain, thermal mass, wind direction and intensity, and the moisture, both moisture in the soil and air moisture.
Great. Well, thanks, friends, for helping to put this together.
Yeah, that was fun.
Indeed.